idea of this slide is you see that one resounding kind of faded arrow from the very beginning to the very end. So that's the bookend idea. On those three themes, God is king, God, the one name idea, he establishes name or reputation, and extends life or blessing. That's an idea that's picked up from the beginning to the very end, and it's interesting if you think about that as you kind of study and read the Word, you start to see that aspects of those three themes peppered in throughout all of the authors of the Old Testament, whether you're reading Psalms, Proverbs, a wisdom book, or any of the prophets especially. And up here is kind of a quick shot of the period of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel during the United Kingdom, Saul, David, Solomon. And then we'll look at the divided kingdom that begins in the divided kingdom in 931. So these are approximate dates. Of course, you've got the Pentateuch from Moses and these early historical books that we covered last fall, leading up to these books that we'll be covering this semester. And then we have this pre-exilic, those three periods we'll refer to. I'll just introduce you to them now. Pre-exilic, the exilic period refers to the 70 years in Babylon, and then we call this post-exilic period the one that I'm referring to, like the vantage point from the prophet Zechariah, that post-exilic period. So they've come back to the land, they've rebuilt, and they were having church for a while. That all happened through the Cyrus decree in 538. But as we group the prophets, I try to do this just to help us make sense of the prophets. We'll talk more about this in the next semester, but the pre-exilic prophets, and there's some overlap here. Some of this is because these prophets have a divine vantage point, and they're able to look into the future, and God gives them an understanding of what's coming. Amos, Hosea, Jonah, and Isaiah. But then the exilic prophets, notice how God turns up the amplification, right, in that exilic period, trying to get the attention of his people. So what happens leading up to the pre-exilic, in 722, the northern kingdom ceases to exist. So Israel falls. In 722, Samaria, and we'll talk about that later on when we get into that 2nd Kings period. The exilic prophets here, Ezekiel, of course, is in Babylon, and then we have the post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, or, if you're Italian, Malachi, the famous Italian prophet, Malachi and Joel. The other historical books that cover this post-exilic period, of course, the people, places, and events, Ezra and Nehemiah. But interestingly, Chronicles, 1st and 2nd, recast some of the same history that's already been discussed. But it's recast in a different way and for a different audience. So we'll talk more about that when we get there. And then you've got some specific books written about some, I call them behind-the-scenes special ops. Bless you. Special ops individuals, Daniel and Esther. So that kind of overlaps this period a little bit. That's kind of the Old Testament in a nutshell, built on the one big theme, God as king, his name is one, his reputation, and the extension of life and blessing. And I just try to make the case that that's a concern that extends throughout the entire biblical picture. That's something that we'll preach or teach. That'll encourage you personally in your own walk. When you read the Word, you'll say, oh, there's that theme again. And it just keeps coming back over and over again. So, well, all that said, we're ready to talk about Samuel. We'll get into now the biblical text and talking about Samuel. All right. You take a big breath here. So Samuel, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel are going to help us understand how some of the transition occurred out of this 400-year period of chaos we call the book of Judges, or the time of settlement, sometimes it's called, and how we get to Israel's first king. And the book of Samuel is to David, this is kind of a loose connection, as John the Baptist is to Christ. Think of it that way. Samuel is when we get to the person of Samuel, he's going to be, you can think of him as the last of the judges. God raises up Samuel as really the last judge to kind of end that period of history, transition it to Israel's first king. So that's it's the first Samuel is a lot about this transitional period between 400 years of chaos and then getting to the first king, Saul. So that's just kind of broad stroke. This is my transition shot. Sometimes I just do a Google image shot and I find some really inspirational pictures. I thought, that kind of conveys the idea of transition. No, that's all that means. There's no deep thought there. Maybe I need to change that picture or something. I don't know. All right, so we're going to find also similarity. Remember last fall we studied the person of Ruth. And the whole context for the book of Ruth, if you recall, the book of Ruth really needs to be read in the same context as Judges. Because what the book of Ruth illustrates is that in the midst of that 400-year period of chaos, there are still elements, pockets, you might say, a faithful remnant, hanging around, having church, doing the right thing, expressing covenant relationship. Of course, Boaz is one of those individuals, and we hear of Ruth the Moabitess coming in to the community of faith from the outside and becoming an active part of the community of faith, Ruth, person, and entering into the covenant, and Boaz acting on covenant grounds, making a way to provide for not only Ruth, but the household of Naomi. You know the story of Ruth. So similarly, we pick up the story in Samuel with another female, a very significant female individual, who's a lot like Ruth, although she's an Israelite. Her name is Hannah. I named my daughter, Ellen and I, my wife and I, named our daughter Hannah. Her name means grace, but we also like the person of Hannah. Hannah's, as you know, struggling with being barren, not able to provide a son for her husband Elkanah. So she's in crisis. Hannah's in crisis, like so many of the Old Testament individuals that we meet up with. There's chaos around them. Their world's caving in. And what we see in Hannah is what she does. Let's turn to 1 Samuel. And Hannah provides for us the proper response, and that's turning to the Lord. And I want to spend a little time, I'm in 2 Samuel. Here we go. Spend a little time focusing on her prayer here in, let's pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 12 down through verse 18. Could I have, Caitlin, could you read for us? Chapter 1, verses 12 through 18.
Now it came about, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli was watching her mouth. And as for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, but only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. And so Eli thought that she was drunk. Then Eli said to her, "How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you." But Hannah replied, "No, my Lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now of my great concern and provocation." And so Eli answered and said, "Then go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him." And she said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." And so the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad.
Okay, so you see that, and we see this in various places in the salvation history. There's crisis, but God answers the prayers of His praying faithful, right? And here we have this desperation prayer from Hannah, and we see immediately in verse 19, "Then they arose in the morning and worshipped before the Lord and returned again to their house in Ramah, and Elkanah had relations with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. It came about in due time, after Hannah had conceived, that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Shemuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord." And of course, she's going to dedicate Samuel to the Lord for service. And so this is another example of a faithful individual um, part of the faithful minority with the spiritual chaos and the storm brewing all around. But she's got her faith planted firmly on terra firma, and God's working through her. You might use this to encourage your congregations and your Sunday school classes and the faithful praying grandmas in your congregation and those mothers, and praying for children and dedicating them and trusting the Lord that they could be used in whatever vocation that the Lord calls them to, and making a difference in this world of chaos that we currently live in, right? So this is a great example of that kind of thing. Verses 27 and 28, you see the dedication, and she's praying, or she's speaking, Hannah. For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition, which I ask of him. So I have dedicated, set apart him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is set apart to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. Now, let's talk about her prayer of thanksgiving. And Hannah's prayer of thanksgiving here in chapter 2, or her song, it's poetry, and we'll talk about poetry a little bit along the way and a little bit more when we get to the wisdom books. But poetry is written much like, songs. That poetry or songs are an efficient, economical way of capturing spoken word that can be easily memorized and remembered in a non-book kind of culture. They had to hear things and remember them, and oftentimes people would remember things in songs like this. So it's not surprising to see a recorded song commemorating, perhaps, Hannah writing this down, much like David would have written down songs to share them with the believing community, would be part of the worshiping hymn book of the day kind of thing. We remember things. We learn theology through songs, and this is the kind of thing that we see here. Hannah's a lot like Ruth, and she's stepping out of the cast, like I said, and giving birth to this, to the just right child at the just right time. She is going to produce Israel's kingmaker. That's Samuel. So the impact of a mother's prayer. You could be praying for the next Samuel for our generation, our day. But let's look at her song a little bit. There's some theology here that we want to look at. Let's see, I'll go to another page here. See, Grace, because your name, Hannah, means grace, so I'll call on you. So let's look at her, and I'll have you read verses, let's start with 1 through 3 in her song.
And Hannah prayed and said, my heart exults in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. Okay, so let's just pause there for a moment. And you see, so this first stanza, stanza 1 here, verses 1 through 3, really focuses on, you might say, the incomparability of Yahweh, of the Lord. And you see the emphasis on my horn, or my strength, is really what the Hebrew's saying there, is exalted in the Lord. You see the reference there to salvation, the joy of salvation, verse 1b, the holiness of the Lord, his incomparability at the end of verse 2, and then him being compared to a rock. You see that a lot. We saw that in Moses and some of his songs that he wrote down for his audience, and referring to God as this unchanging rock, what he has said, what he has spoken. So I'm going to make the case a little bit later on that with the faithful remnant, there seems to be, and it's hard to, pull this out of Scripture too far, but it seems to suggest that with the pockets of the faithful remnant, there were probably small towns, small country churches, where these faithful communities were faithful and raising kids and bringing up kids within a community where they were growing up and learning theology, truth about God. Where's Hannah getting her?
mean, she grew up in church, right? She maybe had some parents who were leading her in the right way and helping her to understand who this God of the universe is. So there were pockets of this. This would have been a byproduct, right, of the faithful community. And we're going to see this down the road. I'll make the case that Bethlehem was one of those small little town country churches. Because out of Bethlehem, we see the faithful remnant at work with Boaz and Naomi and Ruth. They end up going back to Bethlehem. And who's going to come from Bethlehem? Pretty famous king down the road, King David. You know, he's grown up. There's this community, and out of this community produces people like this who come and change the world, help change the world one prayer at a time. So this is what I see in Hannah. Verses 4 through 8. Keep reading there, Grace.
The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down Sheol and raises up.
Keep reading, yep.
Through which verse?
Verse 8, kind of the second part there. You can read the whole verse, yeah.
Okay. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit the seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world.
Okay, so this is, it's poetry. But when you read something like this, you kind of need to slow down and think about the context and what the author here might be trying to say. And this little stanza 2, verses 4 through about 8, and right in the middle there, you see here kind of a reflection that Hannah is giving on the God who impacts history. You know, the reversals of history. And you see a little bit of it coming out. What can God do behind the scenes? Those who were full hire themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry cease to be hungry. Barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many languishes. So there's these reversals in history. Who's sovereign over history, you know? You get a little of that coming through with Hannah here. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol, he raises up. He makes poor, he makes rich. So you see all of this reflection. And it's interesting that, you know, with that, Hannah might be, you know, I'm painting a picture here. I mean, it's not coming directly from the text. But Hannah seems to be fully aware of her role, possibly being poised to perhaps contribute in some very significant way in terms of her walk with the Lord. Maybe the Lord has given her kind of, obviously, some insider information about what's going to happen next. Her son is set apart for something greater than herself. How's that? Does that make sense? Something like that? So we keep going here in verses, in the third stanza, beginning in verse 8, and I'll read this one, really picking up with the last part of verse 8. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's. There's that stability again. The foundation is the Lord's, and He, God, set the world on them. That goes back to the foundation of what Moses lays out in Genesis 1 and 2. He keeps the feet of His godly ones. Now that reference to feet there is going to come into play here in a little bit when we get into some of David's reflections. He's going to talk about feet. We've talked about feet in this class. Feet with a heart with feet attached to it, right? Is that picture of what true obedience means. He keeps the feet of His godly ones. That can mean protection as well. But the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. So Hannah may be looking around her world and recognizing, you know, this is really a dark place, but I know what God has. He's got the last word. He's going to turn this thing around. He's going to turn on the light in the room. It's currently dark, and there's a lot of people stumbling around, but this is going to change. For not by might shall a man prevail. Verse 10, Hannah keeps going. Those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. She's got an awareness of the justice of God. God's concern for justice. Against them He will thunder in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. And he will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the strength or horn of his anointed one. So that's interesting right there. There in verse 9, there's this sense that right here in Hannah's prayer, her song, this reference here at the end in verses 10, this reference to the anointed one who's coming, that's an interesting reflection. If you remember last semester, we talked about, from the very beginning, in the judgment passage in Genesis chapter 2, and when we see judgment being rendered against the devil after the fall in the garden, what's one of the curses that come against the snake, the devil? If we want to go back and look at Genesis 3, remind ourselves. What's that? And there's one more thing. Yes, there seems to be someone that's announced here in verse 15 in chapter 3. I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. So there's this cosmic battle that's set up. He, who's this he? He shall bruise you, aka devil, on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. So that's the proto-evangelism verse, right? We talked about that. That showed up on one of your midterm or final, I can't remember. But it's the announcement of one who will come, who will be part of the divine agenda to remedy and combat and make right the damage that was done in the fall. And that's a he. We don't know who it is. It's someone coming from the seed of humanity. But when that person comes, so there's echoes of this that show up in places like Hannah's song. And we seem to think that now Hannah has this realization that maybe it's going to be, I think, something having to do with this, the anointed one. Maybe he's going to be a king, right? Maybe God is going to do something with regards to a king. He'll bring a king in the situation that will make all things right, and will reestablish, reverse history, and do some of these things that she's reflected on here before in her song. Does that all make sense? Any questions on that? So, these songs that most individuals, nobody here, but others may quickly read over way too fast. They're just chock full of theological reflection. And then they fit into the urgency, the sense of urgency of the day. So Hannah is huge in terms of significance for her time. And she seems to be aware of the what next. Something big is going to happen through this son who I've dedicated, Samuel. All right, well, let's look at the next passage. And remember, I talked to you about the feet. What's interesting about this is that Hannah's song is going to kind of bookend, I know I've used that term a lot today, bookend with a significant song that David will leave with his worshiping church. Let's turn to 2 Samuel 22. We'll kind of move ahead a little bit because I want to make some connections with David and Hannah. And this is his song of deliverance in 2 Samuel 22. Not all of the Psalms are in the book of Psalms. This is an example of one of them that's outside of the book of Psalms, but it is a psalm nonetheless. I'll say this multiple times, I'm sure. I said it last semester, but one of the David, in terms of being a wholehearted king, was his ability to not only know correct theology, but he had the ability to impact and influence others with correct theology through songwriting. So when he's writing songs, those of you who are in the School of Church Music, or maybe you're just a couch songwriter with a guitar at home, songs can have this kind of impact. David was conveying theology as a wholehearted king, as a Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20 kind of king, through song, and leaving these songs with his worshiping congregation. So let's look at chapter 22, and I want to look at verses. We'll just start with verse 1. Let's have Cole. Could you read that for us? Where are you? Cole. Back there, yeah. Read chapter 22, verses 1 through 3.
And David spoke the words of this psalm to the Lord in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He said, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior, you save me from violence."
Yeah, I mean, there's right away we see, right, echoes of Hannah's song, right? You see the references to rock. You see the references to the protection of the Lord, the shield, the horn or strength of my salvation, the stronghold, my refuge, my Savior, thou who saved me from violence. So we see a kind of a parallel or a bookend idea from Hannah's song of thanksgiving to David's song of deliverance. And on this theme of the promised horn, for David, he's going to proclaim that the Lord is his horn of salvation. So he's, let's look again a little bit further into his David song in verse 32 through 36. And Cole, could you keep reading?
For who is God besides the Lord? And who is a rock besides our God? God is my strong fortress, and he sets the blameless in his way. He makes my feet like hinds' feet, and sets me on high places. He trains my hands for battle, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have always given me the shield of your salvation, and your help makes me great.
Okay, we'll just pause there. So again, there's this, for David, and this is near the end of his reign, but he's recognizing, just like Hannah, who's God? The incomparable Lord, right? You see that in verse 32. Reference to God in his unchangeableness, being like a rock, the strong fortress. He sets the blameless in his ways. This reference in verse 34 is kind of interesting. And he set my feet. You remember Hannah talked about feet, right? And I'll go ahead and do it. I know you're waiting, but here it is. I'll have to erase a little bit. I always draw this picture, and I'll introduce it to you all if you're brand new to my class. It's this picture. And the authentic picture for what authentic faith looks like, and I think very convincingly, in the Old Testament, you hear a lot of reference to the heart. And the heart is the center of one's being, intellect, emotion, and will. It's the command and control center. And for the heart, as we'll see, this is going to be an important organ, because the kings in Israel are oftentimes evaluated by the condition of one's heart. We're going to see that David is a wholehearted king. We're going to see that Solomon will be a half-hearted king, and Saul, not to be too critical, but he was a no-hearted king. But the picture of obedience is not just, or what it means to be, in a covenant, faithful relationship with the Lord, is not just the heart which equates to, you might say, the faith aspect of what it means to be saved and in right relationship with the Lord. But then you've got feet attached. This is my rudimentary picture. So this is the whole picture of what authentic faith looks like. It's a heart with feet. And that just basically puts emphasis on the idea that, you have you've given your yes to the Lord, and you have faith, and you've got your trust in Him. But then feet are attached to it. It's going to walk a certain direction. It's going to walk a certain way. It's going to express itself. So the reason that Moses starts with 10 at Mount Sinai, but he continues to unpack the law, not throwing some kind of legalistic ball and chain over the nation of Israel. No, Moses is defining and unpacking all the various aspects of how obedience is to be expressed in the land in covenant relationship, in all details of life. And we looked at the books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy that talk, especially Deuteronomy, that unpack the theology, the teaching, the instruction, which is what, if you remember, law means teaching or instruction, what Moses is doing there. So this is the picture, and we'll see that the earthly kings will all be evaluated by this picture as we move ahead. So feet are an important aspect of the picture. It was for Hannah, and here we see it is for David as well. Now, what he's referring to here, you probably know, in verse 34, he makes my feet like hinds' feet. Did we talk about that last fall? I think we did. But if it's a new idea to you, here it is. The hinds' feet, he made my feet like the feet of a deer. He set me secure on the heights. The picture that was apparently available to inspired authors like David and others like Habakkuk, the prophet Habakkuk, I think he borrowed from David, is this picture. Specially developed feet. Those are the hinds' feet. You can see them on the bottom of those not deer, those are like a mountain goat. And the hinds' feet, specially designed so that they are able to navigate the rocks and the crags in and around the hilly regions of Jerusalem and that part of the world. Specially designed, and these critters can jump and leap and run across rock faces like this, almost as if it's effortless. I could show you a video on that if you're interested. Not today, but these little critters are amazing, and they were inspiring authors like David to say, I want feet like that, God, and turn it into a prayer. So you can understand a lot of emphasis on, I want feet like that. I want those feet here, so I can really trust the Lord. And regardless of the chaotic situation, right, I can dodge around and flit here and flit there and never have any kind of danger. I'm oblivious to the situation around me when I've got feet like this. This is an important picture of these kinds of feet, the hinds' feet. So when David says, he makes my feet like hinds' feet and sets me on high places. He trains my hands for battle so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. We'll talk about this more later, but where did David get his boot camp training? Right? We're going to meet up with him taking on a giant from Philistia, the Philistine giant Goliath. I mean, he grew up on the farm before the days of guns and, not being from the state of Texas where everybody has one. Slingshot, he was pretty good at. So he got his boot camp training with some of these things early in his life as a young boy. But again, his spiritual training with his physical training made him fully capable for the task of being Israel's second king. And we'll talk more about that later, so I don't want to harp on that too much. Now, here's something I don't want to talk about too much. I'm just giving it to you as kind of an interesting comparison. Hannah and Mary. Now we've got to jump to the New Testament. And just briefly here, there's some interesting parallels from Hannah yet to another significant faithful Israelite woman who becomes very significant in salvation history, and that's Mary, the mother of Christ. And you see the parallels there from right out of Hannah's song of thanksgiving to Mary's similar song in the book of Luke. The reference to the bows, those who were full have hired themselves out of for bread. So the reversal passages there in verse 5. He's filled the hungry with good things. Mary says something similar. Here's some more parallels. Verse 1, the very first verse. My heart exalts in the Lord. I rejoice in your salvation. Mary, my soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God my Savior. And there's none holy like the Lord. So the incomparability of the Lord. Holy is his name, is what Mary says. So all of this is interesting. This is how the Lord uses and responds to and directs the path of salvation history. He works through the faithfulness and the fidelity of individuals just like you and me at various times in history. These are people who are not unlike us. Hannah's not some, hey, she's just a figment of some historical imagination. No, she's a real person. She's struggling with real issues like what we have, and she's being heckled by another wife. You can't have a child, and she's struggling with all of this. But out of all of that, chaos emerges as someone who makes a significant change, because she's walking like this. She's got hinds feet, like the picture that we saw before, and she produces this child, and she helps bring him up in a way that Samuel here is able to take this whole chaotic situation and kind of direct it in a way that it needs to go. And he'll be a transitional person, Samuel. He's going to probably act more like a judge than any of the judges before. The idea of a judge, really, in the book of Judges, the idea of a military deliverer. They were raised up by God. The Spirit came on them for a particular job to deliver from an oppressor. But Samuel's a little bit more holistic. He's doing a lot more than just winning a few battles along the way. But we're going to see that there's elements of the book of Judges still hanging around as we go back to Hannah's song in chapter 2. Let's take a look at some of the evidence of the book of Judges still hanging around, and I want to focus here on the sons of Eli. Let's take a look at verses 12 through 17. Let's see. Could I have Hunter? Hunter, could you read for us? Picture. Yeah, there you are. Verses 12.
12 through 17.
12 through 17.
Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. The custom of the priest with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servants would come while he was going with a 3-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Moreover, before the fat was burned, the priest servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." And if the man said to him, "Let them burn the fat first, and then take as much as you wish," he would say, "No, you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force." Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord. The men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt.
Okay, so this is just a continuation. This is just one more illustration that we could have just as easily read in the book of Judges. You remember the wandering, roaming Levite, the Levitical priest, looking for a place wherever he went. He's looking for a job. Where should he have been? What should he have been doing? Then he goes out and gets hired to be basically a pagan priest. And Micah, with hopes, he talks about Yahweh, and that's good because that's just one more God to bring into my little collection of gods that I worship. We talked about the fancy word for that is syncretism. It's talking about Yahweh, but other gods as well. Yahweh is quickly being forgotten over time that way. And this is just one more example. Here we have, and interestingly, this is where Hannah goes to assign her son. Here's my son. And introducing him to this chaos. So it's really, really a step of faith for this family to make this commitment. So Hophni and Phinehas they're doing whatever is right in their own eyes. Yeah, right? That's the thesis statement of the book of Judges. And here it's applied here. With regards to the sacrifices. So Hannah's, whose name means grace, she acts in fidelity, with heart firmly attached to feet, and like Ruth before her, dedicates her son to this kind of ministry. So now the change begins to take place. So Samuel's called by God, and we have that in the next little section here. And in chapter 3, a little bit like what we saw with the call of Moses, Samuel's called 3 times by the Lord, and he's in the process of hearing from the Lord. Samuel, the prophet, now will find out that the Lord is serious about bringing judgment upon the sins or the household of Eli and subsequently Israel as well. So there's coming out of the fog. It's the image picture here. That's all that means. It's a horse coming through the fog. So now we're emerging. Something's changing, and Samuel's starting to get a handle on the situation and what needs to happen. So just after calling Israel, is just after the calling of Samuel, we're going to see that the chaos of the situation only escalates. Israel's going to receive a striking blow, and we see in chapter 4 they're going to be defeated by the Philistines. You see that in chapter 4. Let's read verses 1 through 4, and let's have Jared Jackson. Why don't you read for us in chapter 4, verses 1 through 4.
And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. They encamped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped at Aphek. The Philistines drew up in lines against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. And when the troops came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that he may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God.
Okay, well, let's take a look at this somewhat quiet and unassuming passage and ask ourselves this question: what is wrong with this picture? That was a question that you can often ask when you read the book of Judges. And we'll be asking that question many times as we continue to look at the history books that evaluate the time of the monarchy. What is wrong with this picture? Anybody see it in the first 4 verses? Pardon?
I see Hophni and Phinehas right there with the Ark of the Covenant. It's typically resolved.
Oh, okay. So they're a little bit out of the pecking order. What about the, what has just happened with regards to the Philistines? They've been defeated. And so the idea of moving the ark, where are they moving the ark? Yeah, closer to the front lines, right? So think about this. You've got this mentality of if we just move the ark a little bit closer to the front lines, that will automatically guarantee us success on the battlefield. Is there anything wrong with that kind of thinking?
It's like taking a cross and trying to run it down with a cross.
Yeah, like a rabbit's foot or something. Not that there's anything bad about having a cross, but the idea behind or thinking that it's kind of a rabbit foot. If we just rub it, and it's our good luck charm, right? It'll win the day for us. And this is what syncretism does. Syncretism is this idea that we can talk about the Lord, Yahweh, but at the same time we can talk about other little g gods. So it's this is the slow fade. This is the influence of paganism that has already evidently crept in. This is just a continuation of what we looked at in the book of Judges. So this rabbit's foot mentality, that was Micah's shrine in Judges 19 and 20. I've got a shrine for Yahweh, but I've got a shrine for Baal and other pagan gods. So I'll just rub this one today because I want good crops tomorrow, and then I'll burn an incense here, and hopefully, my business will be productive the next day, and I'll make lots of money, or whatever it is. This is the mentality. Manipulating God. We can manipulate the gods by having statues on our shelf. That's what you do with idols and idolatry. That's the idolatry that's wrapped up in this pagan mentality. We can control the gods because we can pick this one up and put it here, and then we can move it here, and then we can move it out closer to the battlefield. Something like that. We've got to help our people be careful not to have that kind of mentality in our churches too. It's alive and well, that kind of thinking today. We have rabbit's foots. All right, enough of that. I can start preaching there. And then the worst possible thing happens. And this is a picture we see in chapter 5. The ark is captured. Let's read this one. Let's see. Jonathan, could you read chapter 5, verses 1 and 2?
When the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon.
Okay, so could have been, in a way, for Israel, it would have been the worst possible thing to happen. Here's the Ark of the Covenant, which at the time was to be, somewhat symbolic, but actually a reality of the presence of God amongst his people. It was to be in the tabernacle, and now we've got it captured. So, and interestingly, if we move on to verses 3 through 7, we see a similar kind of pagan or syncretistic thinking going on. And let's take a look at verses 3 through 7. Keep reading there.
And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early on the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day.
Keep reading.
And the hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. And when the men of Ashdod saw how things were, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon our God.
So he's, I've heard this passage, the Ark of the Covenant, kind of like becoming this hot potato, and passed between two, and wherever it goes, it just, singes people and all of that. And it's interesting in the context here, we see that, not only can the Ark, the Lord be turned into some, or the Ark of the Covenant be turned into some kind of rabbit's foot, right, to be humanly manipulated by humans, but now, who's captured who? That's kind of the question here. Who really has the upper hand? The one true God of the universe, or any of the gods of the pagan, Canaanite godhead? We've got God is the Lord here is validating who He is. If it's not happening amongst His people, the Lord has a way of getting the job done in other ways. Sometimes, Dagon is pictured here. You see it a little bit in this picture. This special headdress after he got smashed up a bit, and there you see the back end of his tail. But he's the Canaanite deity. He's the fertility god among the various Canaanite groups. This is just a little bit for free. I don't think it'll be on your final, but the root dag can mean fish, thus the headdress that we see here, this fish hat idea. Of course, this is the human picture of what they think Dagon may look like. So there's an older idea of and it goes back to Ugaritic terms and references. The DGN, Ugaritic root, can also refer to grain. So the association there is with fertility and agriculture. So somewhere in the mix of all that, you have this combination, perhaps, of the older Canaanite god, which would have had fertility and agriculture or produce, and then adopted in the Philistines context, and maybe added with that idea of the fish, this fish idea, giving them a little bit of bling. How's that? Godhead bling, something like that. So, regardless, the Philistines had adopted Dagon and as their national god, and at the time, in our context here, in the time of Samuel, temples existed in the Philistine areas in Ashdod and Gaza. So ancient temples to Dagon existed. What happens to the Ark of the Covenant? And then we'll take our next break. It ends up landing in a city called Kiriath Jearim, And it will remain there. The Ark of the Covenant will remain there in that location until David, King David, rescues it and brings it back to Jerusalem. So that's part of the spiritual chaos. At this early stage, Israel will be without their Ark of the Covenant. It'll be outside it'll be in this small town, but it's kind of forgotten for a while. It's just kind of out there and doesn't come into spiritual play until the time of David. Now, after this chaos, we see in chapter 7, Samuel's going to call for spiritual renewal. And we see that in a little bit of it in verses 3 and 4 in chapter 7. Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, quote, Samuel now, he sounds like Moses. If you return to the Lord with all your heart, I'm pointing to the board up here, like this, remove foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you, and direct your hearts to the Lord and serve him alone, and then he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. So the sons of Israel removed the Baals and the Ashtaroth and served the Lord alone. Well, that's going to be nice, but it's going to be short-lived. So these starts and stops with regards to brief renewals, spiritual renewals, won't really kick in that well. And then verses 11 through 13, and they go out to war against the Philistines in verses 11. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and struck them down as far below as Beth-kar. Now Samuel's like one of the judges from the book of Judges. He's raising up an army. He's being used by the Lord to push back an oppressor. And here in this case, it's the Philistines. Verse 12. And Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, and named it Ebenezer, saying, thus far the Lord has helped us. The Lord is our helper. So the Philistines were subdued, and they did not come any more within the border of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. And so that's an example of Samuel being more like a military deliverer in this case. But we're not out of the period of Judges yet. And what's interesting about this period of really a continuation of this syncretistic time of this 400-year period of history, syncretism is well entrenched and well in place and has infiltrated in and kind of permeated the whole, you might say, the community culture at this time, I would say. So let's pause now. We'll take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back for the finish line, and we'll get into first really a high point chapter, chapter 8 in the book of 1 Samuel.